Hello, my name is Paul Sevilla, Adult Services Librarian at the Livermore Public Library. Welcome to the 17th Livermore Reads Together Community Reading Program, sponsored by the Friends of the Livermore Library, featuring the best-selling book, The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. Thank you to everybody tuning in right now to view this very special Zoom program. If you have any questions, type it in the chat. We'll have a Q&A a little later on. And now I am joined by Supervising Librarian Emily Lowell. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for giving me the honor to introduce our special guest today. We are joined by Kate Moore, who is a British writer based near Cambridge, United Kingdom. So Kate is Zooming with us from across the pond. She writes across a variety of genres and has had multiple titles on the Sunday Times bestseller list. In April of 2017, The Radium Girls was published in America. It became one of the best-selling history books of the year and was an instant New York Times bestseller upon publication of the paperback. It also won multiple awards, including the Goodreads Choice Award for Best History. The book was a labor of love for Kate, who discovered the girls' story while directing a play about them. Since publication, Kate has personally presented the story of the Radium Girls in close to 30 states. Her latest book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, was published in June of 2021 and became another commercial and critical success, placing second in the Goodreads Choice Awards for Best History and being named a 2021 Book List Editor's Choice. Her passion as a writer is to help people to have a voice, especially those silenced through injustice. With every book, she hopes to take readers on a visceral journey so that they too can experience the extraordinary lives of others. Welcome, Kate Moore.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everybody for joining the call, and especially for making The Radium Girls your Reads Together book this year. I could not be more grateful, especially because I wrote this book because I felt so passionate about ensuring that these special, special women are remembered. So the fact that you're celebrating them in your community, that everyone's reading, that I'm here tonight, as it is for me in the UK, talking to you about them is so special. So thank you to all of you for this opportunity and for coming along to hear more about these incredible women. I'm going to begin the presentation by doing a short reading from the book, and then I'll talk a little bit more about who these special women were, what happened to them, why it's so important to remember them. And then I'll move on to talking about my research process for the book, how I wrote it. And as Paul said at the beginning, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. And please don't be shy. This is your chance to ask me any questions you have, whether it's about the book, whether it's about being an author, whether it's about the Radium Girls, the Woman They Could Not Silence, or anything else. I'm here for you. So please do ask any questions that you may have. But tonight is all about the Radium Girls. I'm going to begin with an edited extract from chapter 1. I feel that sort of sets the scene for us this evening, and I hope too that it gives a glimpse for those who haven't yet read the book into how I've chosen to tell this piece of real history. It is a non-fiction book and it's thoroughly researched, and every quotation in it comes from an authentic historical source. But I hope that the novelistic way I've written allows you to get swept up in this story and allows these women to feel like friends. So our setting is Newark in New Jersey, and the year is 1917. Catherine Sharp had a jaunty spring in her step as she walked the brief 4 blocks to work. It was February 1st, 1917, but the cold didn't bother her one bit. She had always loved the winter snows of her hometown. The frosty weather wasn't the reason for her high spirits on that particular icy morning, though. Today, She was starting a brand new job at the watch dial factory of the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, based on 3rd Street in Newark, New Jersey. It was one of her close pals who had told her about the vacancy. Catherine was a lively, sociable girl with many friends, as she herself later recalled. A friend of mine told me about the watch studio, where watch dial numerals and hands were painted with a luminous substance that made them visible in the dark. The work, she explained, was interesting and of far higher type than the usual factory job. It sounded so glamorous, even in that brief description. After all, it wasn't even a factory, but a studio. For Catherine, a girl who had a very imaginative temperament, it sounded like a place where anything could happen. She was an attractive girl of just 14. Her 15th birthday was in 5 weeks' time. Standing just under 5'4", she was a very pretty little blonde with twinkling blue eyes, fashionably bobbed hair, and delicate features. All her life, Popular Science later wrote, Catherine Sharp had cherished the desire to pursue a literary career. She was certainly go-getting. She later wrote that after her friend had given her word of the opportunities at the watch studio. I went to the man in charge and asked for a job. And that was how she found herself, outside the factory on 3rd Street, knocking on the door and gaining admittance to the place where so many young women wanted to work. She felt almost a little starstruck as she was ushered through the studio and saw the dial painters turning diligently to their tasks. The girls sat in rows, dressed in their ordinary clothes and painting dials at top speed, their hands almost a blur to Catherine's uninitiated eyes. Each had a flat wooden tray of dials beside her, but it wasn't the dials that caught Catherine's eye. It was the material they were using. It was the radium. Radium. Well, it was a wonder element. Everyone knew that. Catherine had read all about it in magazines and newspapers, which were forever extolling its virtues and advertising new radium products for sale, but they were all far too expensive for a girl of Catherine's humble origins. She had never seen it up close before. It was the most valuable substance on earth, selling for $120,000 for a single gram. That's $2.2 million in today's values. And to her delight, it was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Even as she watched, little puffs of it seemed to settle in the air before landing on the shoulders or hair of a dial painter at work. To her astonishment, it made the girls themselves gleam. They were using slim camel hair brushes with narrow wooden handles. Yet as fine as the brushes were, the bristles had a tendency to spread, hampering the girls' work. They had to make the brushes even finer, and there was only one way they knew of to do that. We put the brushes in our mouths, Catherine said, quite simply. But of course, it wasn't simple at all. And that seemingly innocent, innocuous act of putting a paintbrush laden with radioactive radium paint between her lips led Catherine Sharp down a path she could never have anticipated following. It led her down a path where she and all the other radium girls became poster girls for workers' rights, It led her down a path where she became someone who has left an extraordinary legacy behind her, a legacy that enriches the world even to this day. So who were the Radium Girls? Well, Catherine Sharp is actually a very typical example. They were young women, 14, 15, 16 years of age, but actually records show that some of them were as young as 11. They came from immigrant backgrounds and were from poor working class homes. And dial painting was actually known as the elite job for the poor working girls. And that was for several reasons. Number one was the money. The women were paid by the number of dials that they painted every day. And the most skilled workers found themselves in the top 5% of female wage earners nationally. The Radium Girls earned more than 3 times the average factory floor worker. And at a time before women even had the vote, the Radium Girls could be earning more than their fathers or their husbands if they had them. Another appeal of the job was something I didn't appreciate until I began researching the book. I travelled to America to follow in the women's footsteps, and I looked them up in their local town directories. I travelled to a place called Ottawa in Illinois, where I looked up one of the key Radium Girls in the book, a woman called Catherine Wolfe Donahue. The town directories listed the women's names, their addresses, and their professions. But when I found Catherine's name in that town directory, it didn't say dial painter as her profession. It said artist. Artist Radium Dial Company. And this artistic nature of the job, so unusual, so special, such a coup to get a job like that, this was very much part of its appeal as well. And let's not forget the historic context of the time we're talking about. Catherine Sharp is going to work on that February day in 1917. Now, the history buffs among you will know that just a few months later, in April, America joins the First World War. And that leads to a huge boom in the radium dial painting industry, because the women are not just painting watches and clocks with glow-in-the-dark paint. They're also painting the instruments and dashboards of ships and planes and automobiles. There was a huge boom in the industry, and the women who were motivated to apply for those positions were motivated by a patriotic duty to do their bits for the war effort. One such woman was a very special person called Grace Fryer. She was 18 when war was declared, and Grace, who was an exceptional human being, very bright, very intelligent, very go-getting, she actually had a job that already paid about the same as dial painting did. But as soon as war was declared, just 4 days later, she left that job and she joined the dial painting studio because she wanted to contribute to the war effort. And so many of the women were motivated by this as well. One of the greatest tragedies for me about this story, and there are many, is that when that wartime boom occurred, there were lots and lots of vacancies. So those women who were lucky enough to get a position promoted those jobs to those closest to them, their sisters, their cousins, their friends. Grace Fryer got a job for her little sister, Adelaide. Catherine Sharp, who we met in that opening chapter, she got a job for her cousin, Irene Rudolph. Of course, when what happens to the Radium Girls then happens, it's not just one daughter in a family who's affected, but 2 or 3 or 4. But at the time, the fact that the women were working with their friends and sisters and cousins made it an incredible place to work. It was full of friendship and social camaraderie. As I delved through the archives, I found photographs of the Radium Girls having company picnics. There was Grace Fryer sitting on a little makeshift bridge that ran across the brook that ran behind the studio. She was swinging her legs in the water and eating an ice cream cone. These were fun places to work. And the fun didn't stop when the doors shut. These women would go out after work as well. And Catherine Wolfe in Illinois, Catherine Wolfe Donahue, she said that actually she and her friends used to wear their good dresses to the plant, because when they went out dancing after work in the speakeasies and the music halls, the radium girls could be spotted a mile off. They would be covered in the glowing dust from having worked with the radium paint all day. That was part of the appeal, of the glamour of working with radium. The women were actually encouraged to use it, to use the paint. They were encouraged to paint their buttons on their dresses, their belt buckles. The women practiced, as they were encouraged to do. They painted their nails with it. Some painted it on their faces for glow-in-the-dark surprises. One woman even painted her teeth with the radioactive paint, hoping for a smile that would knock her date dead. The women gained a nickname because of this glowing dust. They were termed the Ghost Girls, because then they walked home at night through the darkened streets of New Jersey and of Illinois, they would be shining like spirits, the ghost girls just shimmering through the streets. Perhaps the most powerful benefit and appeal of radium, however, was the fact that, as crazy as it seems to us today, radium in this time was not only seen as safe, but actually beneficial to health. You could go into your local drugstore and you would find radium pills and radium dressings, anything to treat a range of ailments from hay fever to gout. But its appeal went beyond this. People didn't just think of it as being helpful medicinally. People thought of it as a kind of vitamin, something to boost your health life, something to give you energy if you had got tired in middle age. It was taken as some kind of pick-me-up. So people actually drank radium water as a health tonic. The recommended dose was 5 to 7 glasses a day. And it went beyond this as well. Entrepreneurs quickly exploited these wondrous properties that radium supposedly had. You could buy radium butter, radium milk, radium chocolate, radium toothpaste for a brighter smile with every brushing. People actually sold radium lingerie to try to boost your sex life. So the women working with this all-powerful, all-singing, all-dancing substance thought they were so lucky to have jobs as radium dial painters. But when they were told to put the brushes in their mouths, they didn't accept that with blind faith. May Cubberley, who trained Catherine Sharb on her first day in the job, she said, the first thing we asked was, does this stuff hurt you? But her manager said she didn't need to be afraid. He said it was perfectly safe. But that wasn't quite true. My book actually opens not with chapter 1 that I read you earlier. It opens with a prologue dated 1901, 16 years before Catherine Sharb is going to work on that February day. And it opens with a scientist carrying a vial of radium in his waistcoat pocket, and he receives a radiation burn from that radium. From the turn of the century, actually, people knew the dangers. People knew that radium was dangerous because it burned that scientist. The powerful radium ate away at the tissues in his stomach, and he was left with that red mark, a pain that seemed to intensify over the coming days. And so actually they knew. And the fact that they knew can be seen in the fact that the lab workers who handled radium who were working in laboratories that in some cases were literally next door to the dial painting studios, where the women are lip pointing their brushes and putting the paint in their mouths and swallowing it. Those lab workers, who were largely male, were protected. They were issued with safety equipment, lead aprons and ivory-tipped tongs. They were told to take enforced vacations if they spent too long at work. What was the difference, other than gender? The difference is that the radium girls were handling a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of radium. And it was those small amounts that were deemed to be safe and were put in radium butter and milk and toothpaste and chocolate. But if we dig a little deeper into why people thought a small amount was safe, we can see that the research supporting it was funded by the radium firms who were making money from all those products. So they did research it and they found what they wanted to find. They found that a small amount of radium was safe. And so that's why the women thought they were safe too, to be putting it in their mouths. And people wanted to believe the research, and it seemed to be true on so many levels, because radium did have remarkable properties, life-saving properties. When scientists realized at the turn of the century that radium could eat through a human skin, human tissue, they thought, how can we exploit that power? And so they experimented. They tried directing it at cancerous tumors with remarkable results, because that power destroyed those tumors and people lived where once they would have died. It was truly remarkable, so much so that radium is still used today to treat cancers in hospital. People were struck by its power because radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. That means it emanates its powerful rays for all that time, 1,600 years, for centuries, and people wanted to harness that power. I actually found in the archives an article from the Newark Evening News as one example that was saying to its readers that we would be eating radium in the years to come because, and I quote, doing so would add years to our lives. Scientists thought that if radium could live for 1,600 years without diminishing in its life power, then perhaps we could harness that power, and humans too had finally found the key to immortality. People thought consuming radium would make us live forever. And so the radium girls thought they were so lucky to have access to this expensive, all-powerful, all-dancing, all-singing element. But of course, the marketing wasn't true. And as the years passed, the truth began to show itself. But slowly, very slowly. Radium poisoning is an incredibly insidious type of poisoning, and it takes years to show itself, but eventually it always does. So the radium girls moved on with their lives. The war ended. They moved away from the studios, many of them. Grace Fryer went to get a job in a bank where she rose to become the head of her department. No mean feat in the early 1920s for a woman to achieve such a thing. But as the radium girls moved on, the radium went with them, a marriage from which there was no divorce. And to explain what was happening inside the women, I can tell you that radium is biomedically very similar to calcium. And we probably all know that we're encouraged to drink milk because the calcium in the milk goes into our bodies and it goes into our bones and it makes them strong. Well, when the radium girls ingested the radium girls, their bodies looked at it and they thought, what do we do with this? It's like calcium, I know, I'll put it in their bones. And there it remained. It could not be taken out of the body. There it remained inside their bones, emanating that immense radioactivity for time immemorial. So as I say, even as the radium was inside them, it began very innocently and very slowly to show itself. So Catherine Sharp, for example, had a nagging pain in her tooth, and so she went to the dentist to have the tooth pulled. But then the next tooth started to hurt, and then the next tooth, and then the next, until Catherine didn't have to go to the dentist anymore to have her teeth pulled, because they simply fell out on their own. Other women felt it in different ways. Catherine Donahue in Illinois had a pain in her ankle that slowly spread up through her leg until it settled in her hip. Grace Fryer had an aching back. Edna Hussman found that her arm spontaneously fractured one day. When Grace went to the doctors and they did an X-ray, they found that her vertebrae had been crushed by some unknown power, so crushed that she had to wear a steel back brace to keep her erect. It was a medical mystery. These young women had worked with radium. It was only 5 years or so since they had left the studio, and surely working with radium would see them be fit and healthy. And what could possibly be connecting all these different ailments? Catherine's aching ankle, Catherine Sharp's aching mouth, and Grace's painful back. It all seemed so different. But the women knew. And this is where those friendships that had first brought them into the studio came into their own. Because even though the women had moved on from that wartime job, those bonds of sisterhood still remained. And they talked to each other. The doctors might not have been joining the dots, but the women were. And Catherine Sharp said they realized that there was something going on about this thing. But still the medical authorities failed to take note. It got worse until dozens of young women had died from their radium poisoning, but still no one investigated. In fact, it wasn't until the first male employee of a radium firm died that there was finally an official autopsy, and finally people began investigating what was killing those workers in that radium firm. They finally made the connection. A brilliant doctor called Harrison Martland was the first to connect the dots and to prove that it was radium that was killing and hurting these women. But even after he solved that medical mystery, the company refused to admit responsibility. And my book charts what happens next, how these remarkable women respond to this horrendous injustice, this company that refuses to listen to them. And they are truly remarkable because they are told that there is no hope for them. And there is very, very little money. And to illustrate that point, I want to tell you about one settlement alone in Connecticut. A young woman called Mildred Cardo, who was just 22 years old when she was died. She'd been married just 6 months before, and her newly widowed husband was offered a settlement for his wife's death. The sum of money that they offered him was $43.75. No money, no hope. And yet the Radium Girls knew that this was a battle worth fighting for. One of my favourite quotes in the book comes from Grace Fryer. And when the Radium Girls embark on a landmark fight for justice, when they decide they're going to hold the companies to account, she's asked about why she's doing it. And she says, "It is not for myself that I care. I am thinking more of the hundreds of other girls to whom this may serve as an example." And I think the Radium Girls are an example to us all. They're an example of what you can achieve if you band together with like-minded people and you fight for what you believe in. They're an example that no matter how powerless you may feel, you do have power, and you can make the world a better place, as the Radium Girls did. They achieved an extraordinary legacy. They changed laws, they won settlements and compensation, and they improved things for millions of workers. Ultimately, their case would lead on to the establishment of OSHA, which works to protect workers in the United States today. But the legacy goes beyond health and safety and workers' rights. Actually, they left a legacy in science, because what the poisoning that they experienced was so new. They've gifted us this tranche of knowledge about what radiation does to the human body. These women were actually studied for decades. Those who did not succumb to their poisoning initially voluntarily attended medical tests for decades, so that the world could learn from their sacrifice and the secrets that their bodies had to share with us. And these women acted too as warnings for the world, so that a decade or so later, when America is in the Second World War and they're working to win that war with the Manhattan Project, and workers are working with newly discovered radioactive elements, it's because of the Radium Girls that those workers were protected. The lead scientist on the Manhattan Project wrote in his diary how he was haunted by the Radium Girls. He didn't want what had happened to them to happen to the workers on the Manhattan Project. So he insisted that they do biomedical tests on the uranium and the plutonium. And it was discovered that they're biomedically very similar to radium. And so safety standards were put in place for those workers based on the bodies of the Radium Girls. And it went beyond that too, beyond the Second World War, into the 1950s and 60s, and the nuclear arms race that is happening all around the world. Partly thanks to the studies on the Radium Girls, President Kennedy signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which limited above ground atomic tests, protecting everyone the world over. Even to this day, we are benefiting from the Radium Girls' sacrifice. I've been contacted by scientists at NASA who are using the data on the Radium Girls to research about space radiation and how it might impact astronauts traveling to Mars. What an extraordinary legacy these special women have left for us. Now you might be wondering, how did I discover their story? Well, Emily gave you a little hint at the top of this program. I discovered their story through a play, through directing a play about them. I didn't know the story of the Radium Girls, but in the spring of 2014, was sat on my sofa in London at that time, and I wanted to direct another play. I'd only just made my directorial debut. I'd loved it so much that I wanted to do it again. And so I Googled great plays for women, because I wanted to put on a show that gave actresses a chance to play amazing roles where women are the protagonists in the story. And a play that came back on that serendipitous Google search was These Shining Lives by Melanie Marnich. And it details the lives and the fight for justice of the women in Ottawa, Illinois, Catherine Donahue and her friends Pearl Payne and Charlotte Purcell. I fell in love with the script the moment I read it. In fact, I read only the opening monologue and I turned to my husband and I said, this is the play I'm going to direct next. My connection to this story was that immediate. And what an incredible story it is, this story of women fighting for their rights and standing up for what they believe in, and a story that is imbued with heartache and tragedy, and yet somehow this bittersweet triumph as well. It was just so powerful that immediately I knew I wanted to put it on stage. And so I pitched it to the theatre company that I worked with. My pitch line was Erin Brockovich meets Maid in Dagenham starring the Pink Ladies. And we applied to America for the right to put it on. And the answer came back, no, you can't put the play on. Well, I would not take no for an answer. Already these women were so important to me that I refused to take that. And so I phoned Melanie's agent in America and essentially begged to be allowed to put the play on. And luckily they relented and we got a yes. And the moment I got that yes, I started researching because I knew the play was based on a true story and I wanted to do justice to these incredible people and this incredible story. So I read everything that I could find on the women. And at that time, there were two books that I could read, one about their legal legacy and the other more generally about the science of the story. But to my shock, there was no book that was actually about the Radium Girls, the individual women who had fought this battle. There was nothing about their personal lives and their personal stories, and that's what I was interested in. That's what I was trying to improvise with my actors. You know, we were improvising Catherine and Tom's wedding day. We were trying to find out how many siblings Pearl Payne may have had. And so I was just stunned that that book didn't exist. And by this time, the women were completely precious to me. I was crying every night in the rehearsal room as we told their story. And I just felt really strongly that they deserved a book that celebrated them and that remembered them and honoured them as people. Because if people knew the story of the Radium Girls, and generally they didn't, but if they did know it, they only knew about the Radium Girls, this anonymous moniker, and they didn't know about Grace Fryer and Catherine Donahue and Catherine Sharp. And so ultimately I thought, well, if no one else has done it, if no one else has written that book, why don't I? And it wasn't an easy decision to make because, as you've probably grasped from this presentation, this is a story that's full of science and law and history, and I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a historian. I studied English at college. But ultimately, I thought, well, what I am is an ordinary woman, just like they were ordinary women. And perhaps what the Radium Girls need is not another lawyer or doctor or scientist speaking for them. Perhaps all they need is an ordinary woman who can look at their story and see the humanity in it. And so I pitched my book to publishers and I was lucky enough to get a deal. And I came to America to research the book. And that was so important to me to do because I wanted literally to follow in their footsteps. I wanted to walk the streets that they had walked, to visit the sites of their homes and the radio studios, and to go to the churches where they had worshipped, to visit their graves as well. I also was looking for their voices. I spent hours in archives and museums and libraries, and to my absolute astonishment and delight, I found the records that they had left behind. Letters and diaries, first-person court transcripts and newspaper interviews that they had done. And the Radium Girls told me in their own words what had happened to them. Their voices had been there in the archives all along for over 100 years, just waiting for someone to listen. If you read the book, I hope it is to hear from the Radium Girls, because I've used those first-person accounts and I've woven them throughout the narrative. So I hope that as you hear in their own words what happened to them, I hope it's powerful because this is their record. I feel very strongly that even though my name is on the cover of the book, this is their book, this is their story, and it's their words that you are hearing and reading and feeling as you react to the book. I want to share with you one of my favourite moments from my research trip in America. And it came when I went to visit a tiny museum in a place called Utica in Illinois, which is just down the road from Ottawa. And I'd heard on the grapevine that they might have some Radium Girls material. So I bounded through the door full of enthusiasm and said, I'm writing a book on the Radium Girls, and I'm here to see what you've got, to read your archive. And the docent looked really confused, and she said, well, I'll happily show you what we've got, but I really don't know how helpful you'll find it. And she walked me over to a display cabinet, and there was a single photograph of the girls in their studio and a copy of the book on their legal legacy. And that was it. And I said, are you sure you don't have anything else? And she was like, no. So I was sort of paused for a moment and eventually said, would you mind if we asked your manager, please? I was terribly British and polite about it. She said, okay. And we went over to see the manager, who was this snowy-haired gentleman who'd worked there for decades. And he kind of scratched his head as well, but he said, well, there might be something in the back. Feel free to take a look. And so I went into this back room of this small museum in Utica and lifted a dusty folder off the shelf, and I started going through it. And in that dusty folder, in that small back room of this tiny museum in Utica, Illinois, I found handwritten letters between Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne. And I can't tell you the power of that moment, because these were women I had directed actresses to play. I had seen their story told on stage night after night. And here I was holding their handwritten letters. I was literally able to trace the indentation that Catherine Donahue had made with her pencil 70 years before on that paper. And I could read her words, her powerful words about what it was really like to be a Radium girl, how much pain she was in, how worried she was for her husband Tom having to find the money for the medical bills, how lonely she felt to be sent away from her children, how she felt about having to say goodbye to those children as well. The children and the families were the final part of my research. The book is actually dedicated to the Radium girls and those who love them. And for me, it was such an important part of the story. I wanted to think about and honour those husbands who had lost their wives, those children who never had mothers again, those parents who had to bury sometimes not just one daughter, but 2 or 3 or 4. And so I reached out to them. I asked if they wanted to help me tell these stories. And universally, they did. They were so pleased that the story was being told at last and that someone wanted to hear what they had to say. I was interested in who the Radium girls were and who better to ask than the families. I wanted to know, what were their hobbies? What did their voices sound like? Who was always late? I wanted the families to communicate to me what they remembered about these women who they adored. And I spoke to sons and daughters and nieces and nephews and sisters. And it was so powerful to hear from them about these people. I think my most powerful interview were those I conducted with Catherine Donahue's niece and nephew. And I was asking them separately about Catherine towards the end and about her sick room. I wanted viscerally to be able to bring it to life for readers. So I was asking about the sights and the sounds and the smells. They told me how Catherine had a huge wooden crucifix that she kept above the bed, and how she kept the shades drawn so that the room was always dark. But her nephew remembered that even though the room was dark, there was a light inside it, always, from Catherine herself. Because the radium that she had once used to make watches and clocks glow in the dark was in her skeleton, and it was glowing. And Jim said you could see every bone in her body glowing from the radium. I asked her niece, Mary, about the sounds of the room. Knowing that Catherine was in extraordinary pain from the grapefruit-sized tumour that was growing on her hip, I asked if she ever cried out with the pain. And Mary closed her eyes when she answered me. And I could tell that she wasn't with me in her sitting room in Aurora anymore. She had gone back 70 years in the past, and she was with her Aunt Catherine again. She took a long time to answer, but eventually she shook her head and she said no. She didn't have the energy to scream. All she could do was moan. I think the thing I am proudest of with the Radium Girls is that through this book, Catherine found her voice again, no matter how much it had gone by the time she died. And in this book, you can hear her, and you can hear all the other Radium Girls as well, telling you what happened to them, telling you what they did, showing you how brave and exceptional and strong they were. So I want to finish this presentation by saying thank you for listening to them. Thank you.
Wow, and thank you so much, Kate. Such a truly illuminating discussion here. And as you know, we're setting out as a community this month to read Radium Girls. So we don't always get to feature the author of the title that we have selected as a community. So this is a special treat, and it will just add to the whole reading experience for all of us. So thanks so much. Now we are going to open it up to questions. So all of the attendees, please feel free. We've opened up the chat function. So if you have questions for Kate Moore, we have her here with us to be able to ask her questions. I'm gonna kick it off with one of my questions, and you come from a theater background and you strike me as a very artistic person. And so I'm just curious, you mentioned at the top of this discussion that this is a nonfiction book. And you also had the intention of making it novelistic. I'm just curious, throughout this whole process, did you enjoy the research more or the writing more? And did you feel like you grew in any area of the two?
Thank you for that question, Emily. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say the writing is the bit that I love most. That, you know, when the moment when you're writing a scene that you've thought about, you know, for months or years beforehand about writing, and with the nature of the work that I do, I've done so much research before I even, you know, write that scene. So I know what the weather is like, I know what the people are wearing, you know, what is the surroundings that they're in, what are they saying, if there's, you know, material about you know, transcripts or so on. And so you have everything in your head about that scene, and then to be able to sort of just write it from the heart because you know all of that stuff from your research is just I just love that bit. It's magical the way it, you know, comes, and it is like, it's like some other power or something like that. You're not necessarily thinking, you're just sort of feeling and expressing, and that is just such a spine-tingling moment when it happens. So I love the writing, but I would say, you know, I've never written a book like The Radium Girls before, and the research, particularly for that book, having done the play beforehand and so on, and having never done a research trip like that before, was perhaps, you know, the most amazing experience of my life. You know, to travel to America, to go off on my own, you know, everything about me finding this story and writing this book was serendipitous. You know, I'd At the point I found the play originally, I was still in a 9-to-5 publishing job as an editorial director. By the time I put the play on and decided to pitch the book, I had quit that job and I was freelance. So I could say, I'm going to go to America for a month and travel around. And it was just amazing to follow my dreams and follow my heart and follow their story. So the research as well was special. And you asked about, did I grow in any way? As I say, I've never written a book like this before. So learning how to research, learning how to write a book like this, all of that was new to me. And I will be forever thankful to the Radium Girls for giving me that opportunity to learn and grow in the way that they did.
There's a question in the chat. Are there similar stories to be told in the UK?
Well, yes, is the answer. In terms of Radium Girls specifically, there were Radium Girls in the UK. There were Radium Girls across the world. It was radium dial painting was something that happened all over the world. I focused on America because there was the litigation and the court cases, which gave me a huge tranche of first-person court testimonies, documents accompanying the court cases, newspaper interviews, etc., etc. So in terms of the material that I could draw on, I could only write it in America. That was where the material was. And obviously I met the American women first, so that's where my heart was connected to them. And in terms of, are there similar stories about injustice and, corporate greed? You betcha. Yeah.
And how long did the radium dial painting last or continue?
Well, shockingly, it lasted for a long time, into the sort of 1970s. And I write in the book in the epilogue about how long that went on. They were supposed to be safe because safety standards were put in place after the original Radium Girls, who I write about in the book, after they had been exposed and had brought it to public attention. Safety standards were put in place, but as I write in the book, safety standards only keep you safe if the companies you work for use them. So that's another story, as they say. But yes, it went on for decades afterwards, but supposedly with safety standards put in place to protect the workers.
I was going to ask, Kate, if you mentioned that story. I enjoyed reading about and hearing you talk about finding that collection of letters in a museum in Illinois. And I have to ask, as a librarian, did you find any libraries being particularly helpful? And if not, if it was mostly museums, is there anything you want to say about just the value and role of docents?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, libraries are incredible. And yes, I visited countless libraries on my research trip and research trips subsequently as well. And librarians are amazing. And you guys have such a treasure trove of information and you're so helpful. People always go the extra mile, recommending things, connecting you, thinking of things you haven't thought of, just amazing. So for Radium Girls, I used a real range of sources. So I went to the Harold Washington Library in Chicago, which is a huge library with lots of resources. But I was also at the local libraries in Orange, New Jersey, for example, which had some interesting things on because these communities were poisoned by the radium. In New Jersey in particular, because it was a big radium processing facility as well. There was a sort of waste product which was like sand, radioactive sand, that when they refined the radium, they had this radioactive sand and they used it as landfill all around New Jersey. So in the 1980s, 1990s, there were big court cases because people found out that their houses were built on radioactive sand. And so the local Orange, New Jersey library had useful information on that. I mean, it's obviously a huge story in itself, and I just sort of scratched the surface, but there were some interesting documents there. Local libraries have the local newspapers on microfilm, such a wonderful array of sources that you can find in a library. And I always make it a point now to go to the smaller libraries in particular, because they've often got really interesting local history books that tell you things that you can't find anywhere else. You know, it's when I was doing The Women They Could Not Silence, I was up in this tiny library that only opens sort of 2 days a week or something. And it literally was in one of those, you know, look in the cupboard if you want to sort of stories again, and just a wonderful array of books from, you know, the late 19th century in that case, that sort of had, you know, living memory, you know, people, you know, right in their sort of 80s, 90s, recording things about the people that I was writing about from the 1860s. And you wouldn't find that anywhere else. You have to sort of go and dig and have access to those materials that are in those cupboards, in those libraries in the mountains, you know.
Do you see any parallels with someone once asked, like, how can a woman today read and relate with the Radium Girls of the 1920s? And you know, when I was reading your book, I keep seeing parallels with the Me Too movement and the whole she said situation. It's not not about radioactivity, but it's another industry that harmed a lot of women for decades.
Absolutely. There are parallels, and I think people will recognize themselves in the women. You know, I know I do. I know I feel a really strong connection with them, and I think it's, you know, it can be, as you say, about the sort of, you know, really the eternal story. And this is really what I write about in The Women They Could Not Silence, that eternal story of women raising a problem, raising an issue, talking about it, and being dismissed, being disbelieved. You know, The Woman They Could Not Silence, which I went on to write after the Radium Girls, is about how women are silenced through the claim that we're crazy, and it examines how mental health is used as a weapon against women. And to some degree, that happened in the Radium Girl story as well. You know, Catherine Sharp, quite understandably, you know, ends up being treated for her mental health. You know, you can imagine you're given a fatal diagnosis, you're seeing your friends die around you, you yourself are feeling ill, you know, you are thinking, well, when's my last day? And you're haunted by, you know, the other way. It's not surprising that she, you know, needed treatment for mental health, but the companies used that against her. You know, they brought it up in court. They saw her as a nervous case, you know, hysteric, which obviously, as a word itself, has its roots in hysteria, hysterectomy, you know, the Greek word for uterus. It's all tied in with that. So yes, there are parallels, absolutely, in terms of, you know, women having to keep knocking on that door, keep saying the same thing before people pay attention. And as I hinted and illustrated in the presentation, it wasn't until a man died that actually the authorities took note, did an autopsy, then thought, you know what, perhaps we ought to autopsy some of those women who've been dying, as well as this one guy who's died. So yeah, absolutely, there are parallels, and I think there are parallels too, even on a simpler level of being a woman who, you know, would seek financial independence, who would enjoy going out dancing with your friends. You know, it could be any one of us who ended up in that position. You actually held up the book you held up at the start of the presentation was the Young Readers edition of the Radium Girls, you know, and I'm so pleased that my publisher did that version. That version is intended for students who are not quite ready to read the adult original edition, probably about age 8 to 12. But you think, you know, as I say, some of the Radium Girls were 11, 12, 13, 14 when they started at the dial painting studio. That's an age that young students can relate to. You know, these women were then 100 years ago, and I hope, particularly the way I've written it and using their first person material, I hope readers will identify them, you know, young or old. I think you can see the universal power of their story, how easy, you know, it could have been any of us being those Radium Girls, and how amazing they are to do what they did. And hopefully we can look at their story and be inspired to find that power inside ourselves as well.
Paul, are we continuing with questions? How long do we have, Kate? Or is it, I'm imagining it's getting late.
Well, I'm in your hands, so I'm happy to answer any final questions that you have. How, you know, whatever you guys want.
we should probably close it out soon, unless you have a final questions, and also any final questions from. I do see there's a comment here. It's not a question, but it's from a comment from Sandra that said that she will be reading the book, and an amazing tender presentation, and she thanks you for that.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely comment, and thank you so much for wanting to read the book. As I say, this is my mission: is to try and tell people about the Radium Girls, and hopefully, if you're taken with the way I told the presentation, to go and pick up the book and learn more about their story and who they were and what happened to them, and just how amazing they were, because they deserve to be remembered. You know, I don't know if anyone saw that film Coco a few years back. It was a children's cartoon, and really actually, but dealing with very quite adult themes. And the idea in it was that you know, when someone who has died is completely forgotten by those who are living, they sort of die a second death in the afterworld. And my mission is to ensure that, you know, no Radium Girl dies again in that afterworld. You know, I want people here on Earth to remember them and keep the flame of their memory alive.
That's wonderful.
I just wanted to say that you know, I all throughout grade school, high school, college, I have never heard of the Radium Girls. It was never taught to me. It's not until now that I'm a librarian and that this book was chosen that I actually got to know the Radium Girls and their stories. So I'm so glad that you wrote a young readers edition so that students today can read about these women.
That's great, and you know, I'm doing a school talk on Monday, so it's great. You know, people are reading about them, learning about them. It's a science teacher who's contacted me about doing a school chat, you know, with her science class. So it's, you know, what's great about it is people in all different disciplines can learn about it, whether it's science, whether it's legal history, and of course, you know, the community as well, because this is a story that can impact all of us. As I say, and we can all take things away, whether it's about seeing the modern day with new eyes, to see where those injustices are, to see where those companies who are pushing products that perhaps they don't have the full, you know, research for, you know, it still goes on. Companies lie and they're greedy, you know, whether it's that side of things or whether it's about simply reading a story of strong women, you know, fighting for the sisterhood. There is so much in it that I hope people will respond to.
There are several chats in just thanking you for your time. I just wanted to point out that I think Barbara says that she just finished listening to the book, and it's also an excellent read of the story. So just a reminder for an alternative format out there as we all read this together.
Absolutely. I hope you guys have an amazing time reading it, all the different events that you guys have got going on. You know, I'm just so thrilled that it's happening, and I hope people take the girls to their hearts, and that this is a story that stays with them, however they encounter it, whether it's an event at a library, whether it's one of the other talks you're doing, whether it's the audio book, the young readers book, or the original. You know, I just really hope that it touches people's lives and that you take something with you into your life beyond as well.
Okay, so Emily, you want to close us off?
Sure. Thank you once again, Kate Moore. We are doing this together as a community, so that should make your heart happy to think of us out here in Livermore reading this story. And thank you for writing it and for continuing the legacy of all these women. Particularly, you know, we're really excited to read this at a time where we're celebrating Women's History Month. So really appreciate it. Another shout out to the Friends of Livermore Public Library for funding this. Thanks for always helping us bring in great artists, authors, thinkers, and everybody have a wonderful day. Have a good evening, Kate.
Thank you.
And Paul, I think you had some other events. Did you want to share about some other events?
Absolutely, yeah. So this Thursday, March 9th, 7 p.m. at the Civic Center Library, we are hosting Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory scientist Don Shaughnessy to talk about radium, livermorium, and other heavy elements. Visit our website at library.livermoreca.gov or follow us on social media to learn about our other Livermore Reads Together events and programs. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kate. Thank you,
Thank you.
Emily, my co-host. And look for this program on the library's YouTube channel.
Bye.
Bye.